when I realised that I'd been given this passage to speak on, a part of me was filled with joy. A bit like Paul seems to be filled with joy in this letter. I was filled with joy. When Gemma and I got married, and hopefully you might be able to see a bit of that, this was the reading at our wedding. Well, one of them, the main one, was this passage here. Perhaps it's not your typical wedding reading. You might be thinking of 1 Corinthians 13, with love is patient, love is kind, love never fails. These three things remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Fantastic. But we didn't feel that was an option for us. We got married on Holy Saturday. That's the day before Easter Sunday, the day after Good Friday. That kind of in-between day when we're in a bit of a different phase of church life. And although we were having a wonderful celebration, we felt that we should reflect that a bit in our service that we chose. So this was the reason that we chose that seemed to fit with that, but also spoke to us about the kind of people we wanted to be in our married life together. So there's joy here for me today to speak on this passage. I did spend a bit of time trying to remember what the vicar had actually said, because he's a fantastic speaker. He's spoken at new wine seminars and all sorts. But unfortunately, I think the stress of the day, the joy of the day, may have made it all slip. But that passage has brought back some wonderful memories. But I was also slightly filled with dread, because what I've learned at college is that at various points this passage has been used to fall into all kinds of things that have been labelled as heresy. That's the Council of Dort, but don't worry about that, where they decided on some heresies. So I'm hoping that I don't fall into any of those traps today. I just wanted to mention a couple, just so that you're tuned in to what I might do wrong. The first is a kind of, I'm going to talk about adoptionism. It's one that you could fall into, which is at one end of the spectrum, where Jesus was born and he was completely a man. He was just a man. And then at some point, God adopted him and he became the Son of God. And usually people would say that was at his baptism, because the Spirit came on him and we heard the voice from heaven, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you." Jesus was just a man filled with the Spirit, and at that point God recognized him as a child of God. Easy mistake to make, and it kind of resonates with us a bit maybe, that we're filled with the Spirit and we become a child of God, but it seems to ignore the first chapter of John, where the Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. One trap we might fall into: he was just a man. At the other end, Docetism. Jesus was fully God and only seemed like a man. Only seemed like a man. I won't talk too much about that one, but it wasn't really a man. That if he'd become a real man, that would have ruined his godliness, kind of thing. Two traps at both ends. Orthodoxy is that Jesus was fully God, fully man. So if I say anything that takes us away from that, disregard it and tell me afterwards. Or you might not see me ever again. Either could happen. Either could happen. Hopefully not. But that is a potential thing that we could stumble into here. And the word that we've been given as the title today, kenosis, kenosis, is a Greek word, and it means emptying or emptiness. It's a noun. Emptying. The idea that Jesus gave something up when he came down. And it actually appears in our passage today, not quite in that form. It appears in verse 7 as a verb. Kenosis. He emptied. In the NIV I think it says, he made himself nothing. He emptied himself or made himself nothing. And actually, when I was looking at this passage today, every translation I picked up is slightly different. Even the two versions of the NIV translate these words slightly differently. And I don't think that is translators being bad. I think they're trying to help us understand the meaning of some of the words that are written, because it's so easy to fall into a trap. So yeah, perhaps that's the difference. So he emptied himself. There we go. But he emptied himself. Or he made himself nothing. Verse 6, Paul tells us that Christ was the very nature God. Or in the footnote, literally, in the form of God. And that Greek word there is morphe, the form of God. And that might sound a little bit like one of those heresies that we had, that he just seemed to be God. But actually that word carries the idea of having all the properties of God. He didn't just appear to be God, he had the nature of God. And the next line says he had equality with God, but he wasn't going to cling on to it. Jesus was God, fully God, is what Paul has here. But he didn't grasp it or exploit it or use it to his own advantage. Jesus wasn't in it for his own glory. He came to serve. So in verse 7 we read that he emptied himself, taking the very nature or form, morphe again, of a servant. He was fully God, but also fully human. He took the form of a servant. He came in human likeness as one of us. And Paul goes on to clarify that he really was human, being found in appearance as a man or in human form. Again, that might sound like he just seemed to be. He really doesn't. And that's a different word there. It's called schema. And that means everything that you could sense about him was that he was a man. Everything you could see, everything you could experience about him, he was a man. What he looked like, sounded like, the way he lived, he was a man. Fully God, fully human. But to be honest, even though this passage has caused that kind of debate, I'm not sure that Paul was bothered about that particularly at all when he was writing to the Philippians. I don't think he was starting a debate about the divinity of Jesus. His point is that Jesus didn't come to look out for his own interests. He came as a servant of God the Father. He came as a servant of others. Other lords that they'd known might have ruled in that way, that put themselves first. But not with Jesus. This is a different kind of king. And he goes on to say that because Jesus lived like that, he was raised to life, ascended to heaven, highly exalted. And all of heaven and earth proclaim that Jesus Christ is Lord. Or at least they will do one day. In these few short verses, Paul sums up the incarnation, ministry, death, resurrection, ascension, and possibly also the future return of Jesus in a beautiful way. But his focus is on the humility and servant nature of Jesus. And in verse 5, Paul tells the Philippians that they're to have that same mind as Christ, the same attitude as Christ. These amazing verses that we've looked at flow out of what he's just written in the previous chapter. The translation I've read misses out a therefore at the beginning of chapter 2, because it all relates back to what we heard about last week, actually. This idea that the Philippians are called to live as citizens of the gospel of the King. And Paul is saying, because you are living as citizens of the gospel of the King, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit, and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Last week, Matt told us that his verses were one big long sentence. And actually, in the Greek, that is another big one long sentence. And all those ifs at the start, if this, make it sound like it's conditional. Maybe it will be true. But the Philippians know that all those things are true. They know that all those things are true, which adds more weight to what he says in verse 2. This command that he gives. Make my joy complete. I spent a lot of time looking at the Greek this week. It probably shows, and I'm sorry if I've dumped it all on you. But that word make complete literally means fill up. I even recognised it. I've done enough Greek to know it was like fill up my joy, fulfill it, fill me right up with joy. Joy and rejoicing are such a theme in this letter. All the difficulties that Paul's faced have not taken away his joy. In fact, they seem to have made him increase in joy. But perhaps the Philippians are struggling with that. They're not sure how to find joy. So he keeps talking about joy. And he's discovered that selfish ambition, puffed up sense of ourselves, actually steals joy. It's not all about us. In humility, consider others as better than yourselves. Paul's found joy in living like that. And he's also shown them that Jesus lived like that too. A humility that considers the needs of others. And this idea that perhaps selfishness was one of the things that the Philippian church was struggling with. People seeing their own sense of importance. But there's no place for that in the Christian community, Paul says. Humility is the key to unity and joy. Having said that, it's really important to look after yourself. This is definitely not saying don't look after yourself. And it definitely isn't saying that if you're in abusive situations or anything like that, that you should stay in that. But neither should we let our own sense of ambition or conceit and pride stop us from living a servant-hearted life that God calls us to live in Jesus. And I think that is probably what the vicar at our wedding preached about, if I could remember it. None of the Greek, but live as servants of Jesus, putting the needs of others first, so that there's joy and unity in our life together. So perhaps the challenge for us this morning as we seek to live as citizens of the gospel of the King is to take a bit of time to assess our own sense of importance. Are we following the humble example of Jesus, the God-man who humbled himself to the point that he was willing to give his life up for us? Is there anything in us that needs to die today for the sake of those around us? Let's pray.